always forget it's the red button to turn it on, and it's good to go? Okay. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be standing before y'all tonight. First and foremost, I want to give a very hearty thanks to this congregation for all the people that have reached out during this past week with the situation with Aria, particularly for the comfort that you gave my wife, something that I'm not as good at as the rest of you women are. So I appreciate all the phones and the text and everything that y'all did for our family. It reinforces that I love my congregation more than I love the rest of this world. So thank y'all for that. Tonight, I want to be bringing a lesson. It's kind of been on my mind for 2 years now. So I read an article June of 2021, I think, whenever I went back and looked at it. One that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It was one that the premise that the article was written on was wrong to begin with, but then I saw some Christians making comments on the article. The article was shared to Facebook, and people that I went to FC camp with, the summer camp, which doesn't mean you're a Christian, but these particular people, they claim to be of the Church of Christ, and man, the girl who shared it was, I think she's only 2 years younger than me. So she shared something, and she had thoughts on it that just were a whirlwind of bad information, and bitterness, I think, was wrapped up in that, a lot of pride. So I thought that I would that I would argue against some of the things that she argued for. The title of tonight's lesson is actually Nakedness. So the article that she shared was some self-proclaimed youth minister. Don't know who he is. Don't care who he is, really. He's full of bad information. But he was talking about dress code at summer camp. And he just went all off in the weeds, and he had tons of bad information. I'll read some of the article to y'all, because a lot of the misinformation that's found within it is part of what we're going to be arguing against tonight. So he said, I have been a youth pastor on and off for over 20 years, and I have an issue with the ridiculous ultimatum to my female students at summer camp of one piece with swimsuits only. So we're already starting off way out in the weeds. But number one, he said, I'm sorry that I didn't teach boys to control themselves. I'm sorry I laid the weight of purity on a girl's swimsuit and not on the boy's responsibility to, in his words, not be gross. I am sorry to all the girls that frantically search for an appropriate one piece so that some male youth pastor could deem them appropriate. I am sorry that we have deemed a young woman's body as something that needs to be covered and let young men's bodies be okay to be seen. I am sorry I'll ever let this be an item of a discussion, usually led by men at any youth leader meeting. This must have been awful for my female leaders and students to be a part of. His next paragraph, he said, I'm still a fan of the no produce rule. This is him being, I don't know, glib might be the word. No buns, bananas, or breasts need to be seen. But what makes a stomach overtly sexual? Why is a little cleavage sinful? Why are women meant to feel they are responsible for men's actual sin of lust? So then he concludes by saying sorry, especially to the females we subjugated to our rules. And he ends with saying, female students, wear a swimsuit that lets you have fun. Male students, stop being disgusting and control yourself. So that's his conclusion on the swimsuit debate. He's no youth minister that I would ever want my kids to be learning from. But that in and of itself would have been just another worldly example of the world's definition of what constitutes nakedness, what constitutes modesty. We don't expect anything less than that from the world. But when this girl gets on here And it made me understand that this isn't just something that the world believes. This girl said, when you say that it's a woman's duty to cover herself up, that it necessarily implies that it's okay for men to lust. Another point to make is who made the modesty lines to the knees and to the collarbone. God didn't. These standards were set by men because they struggled with lust. So tonight, I would like to actually look at what God considers nakedness. Is there a standard that we can apply? Or is it, as she claims, that it's all just whatever area you're in, maybe it's whatever congregation you're a part of. Each congregation kind of sets its own rules for modesty. Each congregation sets its own rules for nakedness. You go to one, and they may allow a little cleavage to show, or they may allow the thighs to show, or the stomach even. You'd be surprised how many Easter dresses you see when you go out to eat after Easter, and it's like, did you really wear that to church? You wore that to worship God? Yes, they did. They wore inappropriate dress to worship God. So is there a standard, or is it just up in the air? Is it just for each man to decide for himself, each woman to decide for herself? And the first thing I want to do is I don't want to rehash the idea of modesty because Jason just did a lesson over that not that long ago. We'll go over it just a little bit, but I submit to you that modesty and nakedness are not equivalent terms. Whenever you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9, that's where we'll start out. Here we have Paul writing to Timothy. He says, I desire that in every place that men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise, also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. And we have kind of a parallel passage over in 1 Peter, chapter 3 and verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. So what are these apostles really talking about? Is nakedness even really under consideration whenever he's talking about this? And whenever we think of the word modesty, a lot of times I feel like we try to blunt the knife, so to speak. That whenever somebody's exposing their nakedness, we say you're dressed immodestly. When I think we're talking about two separate things, really. Modesty is a disinclination to call attention to oneself. So my example of that, I don't know why, but my mind goes to this. If you were to show up to a wedding and you were dressed with a dress more expensive than what the bride paid for, you're probably dressed immodest, right? Because you're calling attention to yourself. And there's the unspoken rule that if the bride is wearing white, you don't wear white. Why? Because the attention is entirely on the bride. If you were pulling attention off the bride onto yourself, you would say you're dressed immodestly because it's not your day, it's her day. Don't call attention to yourself. On the opposite end, if you go to a wedding and you're dressed in Crocs and socks and shorts and a cut-off sleeve t-shirt and your hair is unkempt and you haven't shaved, you're also dressed immodestly because you did not dress appropriately for the occasion. This isn't going to the corner store at 9 o'clock at night. This is going to somebody's wedding. We're here to celebrate them. So either way, either you're overdressed and you're drawing attention to yourself, or you're underdressed and you're drawing attention to yourself. Either way, you're immodestly dressed. And it's different than if you came to the wedding and you were naked. If you came in just your underwear, you wouldn't say you're dressed immodest. You'd say you came to the wedding naked. That's an entirely different issue altogether. Also consider for Isaiah chapter 3, verses 16 through 23. 16 through 23. And that day the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes and the amulets, the signet rings and nose rings, the festival robes, the mantles, the cloaks and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans and the veils. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Instead of belt, a rope. And instead of well-set hair, baldness. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth. And branding instead of beauty. So all those things that the women of Israel were wearing were meant to draw attention to themselves. It's something that they took pride in. I also kind of, and this is just another one of the images that come into my mind. It says that the ankles jingle, and that reminds me of a cat. Whenever you have a cat in the house and you keep stumbling over it, what do? You put a bell on its collar, right? That way, wherever the cat is, you know where it's at. So if you hear a jingling bell behind you, you know not to step on it. What's that bell intended for? It's to call attention to the cat, correct? So if we're walking around with jingling ankles and everywhere we step, everywhere we walk, you can hear us coming, it's drawing attention to yourself. So that's my idea of modesty. And I think that's what's under consideration in 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Timothy 3. You can read nakedness into that. You can say that, well, if you're exposing your naked body, you're drawing attention to yourself. And I think there's a moderate application to that, but I don't think that was the thrust of what they were getting at. They were talking about having fancy hair, wearing jewelry, drawing attention to the outward appearance of all these fancy things that they had, instead of the inward spirit, a gentle and quiet spirit, which God found precious. And I also, just as another example, the tattooed face syndrome. It's where you have somebody that has not natural hair color, maybe they have piercings on their face or a tattoo on their face, and then they wonder why you're staring at them. And well, it's because you drew attention to that part of your face, did you not? A lot of people get frustrated whenever you point that out, but it's like you're dressed immodestly, not because you're exposing your nakedness, but you're just out of sorts. It's unnatural to have blue hair or green hair, any other color you can think of. So instead of immodesty, a godly woman seeks to glorify God through the way she dresses by having mankind see her heart and her gentle and quiet spirit. So that's nakedness, that's immodesty. And like I said, Jason probably did a much better describing all that a couple weeks ago. I encourage you to go back and listen to his. But now I'd like to look at what is nakedness, and does God or man set the standard for it? And I would submit to you that nakedness is not simply being devoid of clothing, as if you were wearing nothing at all. It is more akin to not wearing adequate clothing. So let's look at Genesis chapter 3. And in verse 7, and then we'll see in verse 21. This is after Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit of the garden, that which they were told not to, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And there the record says, then the eyes of both were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So at this point, Adam and Eve were covered by something. At first they were completely devoid of clothing. Then they sewed together fig leaves and made loincloths. But then if you go over to verse 21, starting verse 20, the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them. So whatever they made for themselves with those loincloths and the fig leaves, God did not find sufficient. He made for themselves garments of clothing. So merely covering the genital region is not sufficient to cover nakedness. When God clothed man, he clothed them in garments of skin. And the interesting thing is, this translation, particularly the ESV, translated that garment as, that word as garment. But if you go back and look in the concordance, it's translated as coat twice, dress once, garment twice, and tunic 14 times in the Old Testament. So this word that we're looking at, it's really a tunic. So this is the idea, this is what the word I would like to work from, is this concept of a tunic. And so if you go to whatever dictionary on the internet, I just typed it into the word search. The very first definition is going to come up. A tunic is a simple slip-on garment made with or without sleeves and is usually knee-length or longer, belted at the waist, and worn as an under and outer garment by men and women of ancient civilizations. But if you go to the second definition, it's kind of this, it's a word that's been bastardized a little bit by modern language. There it's just a hip length. So instead of going all the way to the knees, it's just a hip length or longer blouse or jacket or a short overshirt. Not necessarily one that goes from the shoulders to the knees. It's just a oversized shirt, If you go to any department store and you ask for a tunic, I doubt you they're going to go grab you a garment off the rack that goes from the shoulders to the knees. We just consider that a dress nowadays. But that used to just be what a tunic was. So the standard I propose that God used to clothe mankind was from the shoulders to the knees. Consider also Exodus chapter 28 and verse 42. I know we've gone over this a couple of times here at this church. But whenever the priestly garments were made for Aaron and his priests, here we have the Lord's instructions. For Aaron's son you shall make coats and sashes and caps. You shall make them for glory and beauty. And you shall put them on Aaron your brother and on his sons with him, and shall anoint them and ordain them and consecrate them, that they may serve me as priests. And then in verse 42, you shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs, and they shall be on Aaron and on his son when they go into the tent of meeting. So that expression from hips to thighs doesn't mean from the hips and where the thigh starts. The idea of that phrase, from the hips to the thighs, was it covered their hips and all of their thighs, so down to the knees. The priests were required by law and under penalty of death to clothe themselves in these certain garments. The undergarments the priests wore were from the hips to the thighs to cover their nakedness. So if we look at God's definition of nakedness, the thighs are part of that. If your thighs are uncovered, you're naked in the eyes of the Lord. So then rather than wearing one piece of clothing from shoulders to knees, typically we wear two pieces of clothing, such as shorts, pants, or a skirt, and some form of shirt or blouse. The principle of the shoulders to the knees still applies. So just some examples, and this is the part where it goes back to that original article where it said, what's wrong with the little cleavage? Well, you're exposing your nakedness. That's what's wrong with having a little cleavage. Whenever we talk about from shoulders to knees, we are naked if we leave our shoulders exposed, or say we cover our shoulders, but then it's wide open to the back, or we cover the shoulders, but it dips down in front and exposes the breast, or whenever we cover the shoulders and the breast, but then we have a shirt that comes up and now our stomach's laid bare. Or when we cover the entire upper body, but we expose the hips and the groin region. And then lastly, whenever we expose the thigh. And this, by the way, I'm not speaking just strictly to women here. This is a problem for men. I just saw a fifth grade teacher from Academy who said I saw her at Academy while we were shopping for baseball clothes back this spring. And she's like, the boys' shorts, they don't hardly go past the mid-thigh right now. I used to call them fraternity shorts. But it's just a popular style for boys right now. It doesn't go all the way to the knees. It stops good 3 to 4 inches above the thigh. And I remember whenever I was working out in college, we'd see all the time a sleeveless shirt, which still covered the shoulders, but then for whatever reason, they would cut the slit of the shirt all the way down. And sometimes it would go all the way to their hip. And it isn't really a mobility thing at that point. It's just so they could show off their obliques and their muscles, and they wanted all the girls to see, so they exposed their nakedness there at the gym. And I don't mean to give some comprehensive list this evening. I mean, the amount of time that I would have to spend up here, and I'm not even aware of all the different types of clothing out there that could expose your nakedness. But I mean, we've got clothes that are transparent, that whenever that you wear them and you can see straight through them. We've got jeans with holes in them, and sometimes they're not, I've been working outside and I got a hole in the knee from crouching down working on some. They put the holes all the way up near the buttocks region and all the way up on the thigh, so you're covering the leg and then exposing your nakedness through this little hole in your jeans. Why they do that, I don't know. I don't know. But then, you've got skin-tight clothes. If I wore clothes that covered all my skin but was so tight that everything around my body was completely exposed, have I really covered my nakedness by just making sure that the skin's not showing, but showing everything else? All these different ways to get around this idea of clothing ourselves and making sure that we're not exposing our nakedness, just trying to subvert God's authority and just worldliness in general. So why is it important to cover your nakedness, and why am I preaching this message tonight? Well, first and foremost, it's to be pleasing to God. Everywhere we read of nakedness in Scripture, it's tied to shame. It's amazing to me that I don't know how I would have reacted in the Garden of Eden, but if I disobeyed God's one command and I had knowledge of good and evil, I feel like I would have such existential dread that I would just fall on my knees begging for forgiveness. But Adam and Eve, the first thing they did was go clothe themselves. Apparently they were so ashamed of what they were and what they looked like that their very first reaction to sinning and breaking God's only commandment was to go clothe themselves. That's how shameful they felt about their nakedness. We see that Noah cursed his son for exposing his nakedness. David was mocked by Michal for dancing naked. Numerous prophets throughout the Old Testament speak of the humiliation Israel and Judah would suffer as they were stripped bare before the nations. It was humiliating that they would be conquered by the other nations, and that's the expression that God used. I will expose your nakedness to the nations, or I will strip you bare before them. And even in the New Testament, we don't see nakedness talked about too terribly much in the New Testament, which is why I've got a lot of Old Testament examples. But if you go to Revelation chapter 3, starting in verse 17, this is Jesus' letter to the church of Laodicea. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich, and white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes that you may see. So even in the New Testament, it's always been to expose yourself, to expose your nakedness, is to expose your shame before the world. The next thing is if you're single, it's for your own purity, which I suppose it also, even if you're married, it's for your own purity, but there's a little bit more to being married. But a lot of young people, unmarried people, think that they expose their nakedness to attract the opposite sex. Whether that's men or women, they expose their nakedness to be attractive to the opposite sex. But that's where that portion of 1 Timothy and 1 Peter come into play. That's not what you want people to be attracted to within you. You want them to be attracted to the gentle spirit. You want them to be attracted to the fact that you have obeyed God and you have a standard for yourself. Consider 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. So if we're going to wear the title of Christian, and we're going to go out into the world, and we're going to expose our nakedness and our shame before the world, who are we shaming apart from just ourselves? We're shaming God. God bought us with a price. We should take glory in that, and we should submit ourselves to his standard of clothing and his standard of not exposing our nakedness, and we should do everything within our power to bring glory to him. And I admonish this young lady to forget about other people in this scenario. A lot of times whenever we preach about modesty and we preach about nakedness, for some reason we found it beneficial to go straight to, well, you're covering yourself up so you don't cause somebody else to sin. And I would hesitate before you jump straight to that argument, because that in and of itself is a good argument. We want to not lay a stumbling block before our brethren. That, of course, that's across the board no matter what the situation is. But this idea of dressing modestly and this idea of covering our nakedness, it's meant to keep yourself pure. You are sinning if you expose your nakedness, whether or not somebody's lusting after you or not. Somebody may not even be looking at you. You could just be inappropriately dressed in public with the knowledge that you're inappropriately dressed in public. And you're not sinning because you're causing somebody to stumble. You're sinning because you're not adhering to God's standard of covering your nakedness. So I would hesitate to bring that up as a first offense, because I think that's how you get the bitter reaction of this young lady, and especially of that man that was writing the article, where he said, "I'm sorry I laid the weight of purity on covering a girl's body instead of a boy not being gross," which is just immature wording in and of itself. But it is on each individual person to hold yourself to God's standard and be pure before God by clothing yourself, whether or not you're causing somebody else to sin. So even if you're single, even if you're looking to attract other people, it's not holy and pure to uncover your nakedness in order to do something like that. But then there's another aspect of it if you are married. If there is an acceptable way to expose your nakedness, and there is an acceptable way to enjoy the body of another person, that is between a man and his wife. God has actually established a place for that to occur. It's not to be paraded out in front of the masses for everybody to see, but whenever you're in that private relationship between a husband and a wife, there is a place to expose your nakedness and to be attractive in that way. But a man or a woman parading their flesh around for others to see is as unfaithful to the marriage as a spouse that has wandering eyes. A lot of times we talk about, well, my husband looks at other women, or my wife looks at other men, but then we don't do that self-examination. Have you been exposing yourself to other men or exposing yourself to other women? It's the same principle. What should be a husband's eye should be for his wife alone, but a woman's body should be for her husband alone, and vice versa. Either way, it works both ways. But consider Proverbs chapter 3, verses 15 and 20 for this. That is the wrong verse. There we go. Sorry. Proverbs chapter 5, 15 through 20. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. So here he's talking about the son not straying to drink water from his own cistern, but the same principle could apply to nakedness. Should your springs be scattered abroad? Should you be showing off your flesh to the public? Streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone. That has the idea of privacy with it, with your spouse, with the person, the wife of your youth or the husband of your youth. A young woman's body, it's a precious thing. It's a beauty that's fleeting. We all know that. So there is the temptation to want to show that off while you have it. And there is a place for that, which is the marriage covenant, not out in public. And it's, like I said, same thing for a man's body. If you feel like you've got the body to show off. And the last point on this is your flesh is not your own. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 2 and 4. Here we're specifically talking about the conjugal rights between a man and a woman. But as part of those rights, I would include this in there. Of course, there is the sexual relationship under consideration, but there's also this exposing of nakedness. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So whenever you take your naked body and you expose it out in public, it's not just your body. It's not just what you own. Your spouse also owns that. And I doubt your spouse would appreciate it if you were exposing what is rightfully theirs to everybody else. Consider also Leviticus chapter 18 and verses 6 through 8. Here, I'm not sure if in this Hebrew language, uncovering somebody's nakedness actually means the sexual relationship that's there. But nevertheless, like I said, either it's the sexual relationship or it's uncovering of nakedness in a visible sense. Both of them are applicable here. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. And listen to this. Which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother, and you shall not uncover her nakedness. So at the beginning, we're uncovering the nakedness of the father, but the possession is the wife's. The wife owns her husband's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. So see, even there, you're uncovering the possession of somebody else when you uncover the nakedness of somebody. Or if you voluntarily go out and uncover your nakedness, you're not just uncovering your own, you're uncovering what rightfully belongs to your spouse. And the last admonition that I have is to start teaching your kids now. Children have no concept of nakedness, just like Adam and Eve before they ate of the fruit. They were naked and unashamed. We're the ones who have to protect our children. They may not know the standard, but we do. We don't want to teach them wrong when they're young and try to change course when they're older. And the swimsuit's a perfect example. Even if it's a one-piece swimsuit, you go to the kids section, and I know because I have 4 little girls, you go to the kids section, you look for a swimsuit for the little girls, and they're all one piece. They even have bikinis for the little girls, which is just disgusting to think about. But they have one-piece swimsuits, but very rarely do they cover up the thighs or the buttocks region. I mean, they're just these one-piece swimsuits that just barely cover anything. And then you have parents that take them to water parks and expose their child's nakedness for whoever to see. I mean, I get messages almost every single day from those Amber Alerts about kids that have been abducted, kids that have been injured. And it's like, it's our job as parents to protect our kids. And part of the way that we protect the purity of our kids is we clothe them appropriately before they're old enough to understand how to clothe themselves. Whenever they get older and they have to clothe themselves, it's on, we have a little bit less authority to tell them exactly what to do. So it's, we rely on the principles that we teach them whenever they're younger, so that whenever they're older, they understand what God's law and what God's standard actually is. That way we don't end up getting to, it was 2 years ago, and she's 2 years younger than me. So she was about 25 to 26 whenever she wrote that it was just men who set the standard, and it's just men who couldn't control their lust, and that's why she couldn't wear a 2-piece bathing suit. You got to 25 years old, and nobody ever told you that, hey, there actually is a standard, that God does consider exposing the thighs or the stomach or the breast as uncovering your nakedness. You made it 25 years, and I guess nobody sat down and just explained it to her, that this isn't so that you don't cause other men to lust. This isn't some standard that's arbitrary and different based on the places that you go, but God actually has a standard, and he had it from the beginning. All the way back in the beginning, whenever he first clothed Adam and Eve, he made them tunics of skin. Just simply covering your private area wasn't enough. There had to be more. So just like the Israelites in the Old Testament, we are only ever one generation from departing the Lord. Just like they were in the book of Judges, they went and they captured the entire Holy Land, and then another generation that grew up that didn't know the Lord. So I fear sometimes that in order to maybe perhaps salve a conscience, or like I said before, we seek to blunt the dagger just a little bit. We don't actually go to the scripture and we don't actually open it up and say, these are what God considered nakedness throughout the Old Testament. And we don't take the time to show people that there is a standard. And then if the standard gets lost somewhere along the way, anything goes. Anything goes. That's how we get all the way to the part where we're wearing a two-piece bathing suit in front of the masses, exposing our nakedness for everybody to see. And we don't have a problem with it, because that's on his responsibility not to look at me, not my responsibility to clothe myself. And so that's the lesson I wanted to leave y'all with tonight. Like I said, it's been in my heart for about 2 years now, ever since I read that article. But Jason is a healthy man, and he's not gone very often. So I didn't have an opportunity to preach it. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm pointing a finger at you. I'm pointing a finger at myself as much as anybody. And I have 4 girls, and it's something that I have to study because I'm responsible for protecting them now, but I'm also responsible for arming them for the future so that whenever they get older, they don't grow up wondering, well, is this just what my dad said I had to do, or is this actually what God has prescribed? And they have their own sense of purity rather than they feel like they're bearing the weight of the society around them. And then they become bitter like these people were. And they become uninformed, and then they share articles on Facebook, and then they spread misinformation to everybody else. So that's the lesson tonight. If you're here tonight and you need to respond to the gospel, we offer that opportunity at this time. If you need the prayers of the congregation or to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, come forward while we sing.